Okay. Good morning. My name is Lauren Kozyra, and I'm the president of the Wrightwood Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for our online presentation about the Wrightwood mud floods of the 20th century. I'm going to start with just a few quick announcements. Firstly, our museum hours for January and February have been modified to 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. To account for the slower season and to give our docents a bit of a break. Also, Kate Kozyra, our treasurer, is moving out of Wrightwood, and so we will be on the search soon for a new treasurer. So if you know anyone or if you are interested, feel free to reach out to me at the contact information that is shown on the screen here. And finally, today we'll be looking at items from the collections in the museum. And I just want to remind everyone that residents and visitors, anyone who's interested in doing research on local history topics, is always welcome to either come in during museum hours to view our collections or to make an appointment and I can meet with you and have you look at our collections. Just wanted to put that reminder out there. Also, we have some additional upcoming events. Our next member meeting in February will also be hosted online. And at this meeting, we will be looking at the history of the plans for very early Wrightwood in the early 20th century, as well as some of the advertising propaganda around it. In March, we have our History in a Suitcase presentation brought to us by the Wrightwood Elementary fourth graders. That's on March 3rd. March 11th, we will be doing a tour of Camp Cajon. That is going to be hosted by the Camp Cajon Project, and we'll meet down at Camp Cajon at 11 a.m. And then in April, we have another field trip. We'll be doing a wildflower walk with Wendy Walker of the Puma Canyon Preserve. Details will be forthcoming for that. Okay, so jumping into our talk today, I'm just going to give us a little bit of background before we jump into the specific floods. So firstly, I was inspired to choose this topic to present on last fall when we saw the two get flooded with mud and debris again when we had those heavy rains. And then I saw a lot of chatter on Facebook about people asking about the floods in Wrightwood and the history of our mud floods. And there were some pretty dramatic floods and mud floods that we'd seen. And so I thought I'd dig into that to see what collections we had in our museum and share on that today. So today we'll be looking at, I'm calling this a collection share. I'm not the expert on this. I've just dug through the information to share with you. But what we'll be looking at is some firsthand descriptions of the mud floods through news articles, photographs, and some video footage. And so I'm going to be really relying on the resources that we have in the museum to share with you today. So a little bit of background about mud floods. What are they? So Wrightwood saw at least 4 significant mud floods in the 20th century. For all of those, the Heath Creek has been the culprit in these worst of our mud floods. And it's actually a result, geologists have found, of the landslides on Wright Mountain. So if you see this image I have here, where my cursor is, you see mountain landslide. This is Wright Mountain. And the landslide goes right into the base of the Heath Canyon fan, or our Heath Creek. And so essentially what has happened is that this landslide, which geologists date to about 500 years ago, they used the age of the Jeffrey pines growing in that area to date this landslide, and they think it's about 500 years old, maybe older. And all that debris from that landslide landed in the mouth of the Heath Canyon. And so that essentially produced the conditions for these giant mud floods that we'd have coming down that canyon. There's also been, lots of mud flowing through Sheep Canyon, but it hasn't been nearly as dramatic. All these ones that we'll look at today have been related to our Heath Creek. So what causes these mudslides? Why do they happen? Geologists say that one of the main reasons that you see this, in addition to having all of that mud and landslide debris in the mouth of the Heath Canyon, is when we get a lot of snowpack that melts very, very quickly. So a warm spell that melts that snowpack really quickly, and then it's just more water than the canyon can contain. Other reasons they note is cloudbursts, so rains that are just really intense, or unexpectedly heavy rainfalls in the fall or springtime. Small mud flows occur almost every year in our region, as we saw last fall with the mud that kind of washed out part of the two, and we had the dozers out there cleaning it up. And the big ones are usually associated with very wet winters or a series of wet winters, one after the other. And spring mud floods in Heath Canyon have been known to occur in 1941, which we'll look at today, which was the largest in our known history. 1943, 1965, 69, 73, and 78. And then in our current century, we had another one in 2004. So that's just a little bit of the background on these mud floods. Why do they happen? And what the research, there's been several geology papers written on our region and why we get these mud floods here. So let's go ahead and look at the first one that we have some good information on. It happened in May 1941. Just as a reference point, Wrightwood was much smaller in May 1941. We had approximately 390 homes in 1942. So if you think much tinier community, under 400 homes at least at this point. So the first thing I want to look at related to 1941 is an article that was published in the Mountaineer Progress in 1970 by an individual named G.S. Corp. It's titled 1941 Heath Mudslide Showed Village Cooperation. So Corp was an individual who lived in Wrightwood through the 1941 floods. And so he recounts for us his experience of these floods. So what he tells us is that in 1941, weather stayed unusually cold until May 1941 and suddenly warmed up. The resulting runoff of melting snow was faster than the wash could handle and soon turned into mud. He noted that the mud had about the color and consistency of concrete. And when you looked at it, you thought of picking up a trowel and starting to lay bricks. On Thursday, May 8th, 1941, he quotes, "No one was worried and people thought it would be easily controlled. But each hour, the flow increased and soon was moving with irresistible force. It soon got to tearing out rocks as big as a house and trees 30 inches in diameter, and even larger crashed down the course of the mud avalanche. You could hear the groaning, crashing, and creaking of the powerful mud stream almost all over Wrightwood. 2 houses were ruined. The ski lodge on Sparrow, and another on the east side of Lone Pine Road, south of Sparrow Street, which apparently was owned by movie actor Frank Jenks. As it's told, Jenks's antique car is still under the mud, and a fireplace chimney is still sticking out of the mud. So I haven't walked around that area yet to try to find those things, but I think that would be an interesting walk to do. He also notes that many others were ruined. One interesting note he also comments in here is that for this mud flood, there wasn't a lot of snow in Wrightwood proper, but apparently there was 60 feet of snow on Blue Ridge when it began to melt. When I told this to my husband, he didn't believe it and wants to go back and look at some more records to corroborate it. But in a couple different stories that I read, they talk of 60 feet of snowpack up on Blue Ridge that was melting down into Wrightwood very quickly. So if we look at, and I'm just gonna, there we go, collapse faces so that it's not a recording. Okay. So if we look at this next article, this is from the San Bernardino Sun from May 14th, 1941. And this one I actually pulled from There's a great resource if you're ever looking for historic newspapers. University of California, Riverside has what's called the California Digital Newspaper Collection. And they have many, many newspapers that they've digitized. And this includes the San Bernardino Sun. And so if you're looking for historic information in our area, you can go search this database, which has tons and tons of pages of the San Bernardino Sun. So that's where I pulled this one from. This is not from our collection. But in this article, it's described that 4 cabins in the Wrightwood area, one of which is shown above right, have been wrecked since Sunday by an odd mud river coursing slowly down the mountainside from high altitudes, where there has been unusual runoff from melting snows and heavy rains. The mass has overturned trees and other objects in its path. And here we have another article, which is from the San Bernardino Sun from May 29th, 1941. And it reads, a Los Angeles geologist gazed across the broad expanse of flowing cement gray mud at Wrightwood, looked up at the mountain peaks, source of great lava-like tide, and commented incredulously, I don't believe it. His remarks typified the bewilderment of mountain residents who for nearly weeks have seen the heavy mud move down from the hills and watched helplessly as it cut a great swath hundreds of feet across rich forest lands, engulfing cabins and trees and burying roadways. The tops of trees visible up and down the great path of mud present a weird picture. The moving tide gives forth a sound like the gliding of skates over ice. Occasionally, there is a dull splash as one rock rolls atop another and falls back into the phlegmatic stream. A new section of earth falling into the stream from the scarred mountainside causes a new wave of mud, like a tidal swell in slow motion. And that's one interesting thing, especially in this flood in 1941. There was a lot of description of it, of being like a tide, like waves that you'd see at the ocean. So next here, there was in 1963, a summary report was published in the Bulletin of Geological Society of America by Robert P. Sharp and Lawrence H. Nobles. They had done some more research on the nature of this flood. And some of their findings, you can see one image here with this buried house. Some of their findings include that the mud flow ranged from 1 to 2 feet per second up to 14.5 feet per second. So the mud moving up to 14.5 feet per second. They described the flowing material was light gray and of a mushy, soupy consistency, just like freshly mixed concrete. The largest boulders, as you can see here, were 6 feet in diameter. And common was 2 to 3 feet boulders near Wrightwood. And they state that at least 3 cabins and several garages or sheds were damaged, 2 of the cabins beyond repair. Material, they say, was transported approximately 15 miles with the mass flowage. And they note that from eyewitness accounts, the flow advanced as a series of muddy debris waves or surges succeeding each other at intervals of a few seconds to several hours. Activity attained a peak in the early afternoon and appears to have decreased at night, probably because of decreased melting of snow. And in total, the county flood control records note that 1.2 million cubic yards of mud were moved during the Wrightwood mud flow of 1941, which is a pretty astonishing number. And then finally here, taken from that geological report, is a map of the source area and upper part of the Wrightwood mud flow. So I think the interesting thing here, if we look at that, they show kind of coming down Heath Canyon here. If you look right here, this is where my pointer is. This is Lone Pine Canyon Road. Let me see. Thought I could pull up a highlighter, but I'm not sure I can. You can see where Lone Pine Canyon Road goes and how wide the mud flood got right there. And so in the next flood, 1965, we have more information that will talk about the actual streets that were impacted. And I think it was a lot of the same streets, Sparrow Street, Blackbird Road, Lynette, in this Lone Pine Canyon area where Lone Pine kind of cuts across the wash. But you can see just how wide that was there. Okay, so that was kind of the first major mud flood in Wrightwood's established history. The next one that is very notable is November 1965. And I don't have information for the number of homes in Wrightwood in the 60s, but by 75, there were 1,600 homes. And so as you can imagine, in the 60s, there were a lot more homes in this area. So a mud flood would affect a lot more people. And I'll note also that this was the flood when we lost Lone Pine Canyon Road over Heath Creek, and we now have two separate roads kind of cut off on either side of the wash. So this was the flood where we lost that one. So first I wanted to note we have some articles from the Wrightwood Mountaineer, which was the former name of the Mountaineer Progress, from December 2nd, 1965. And I'm just going to read a little bit from this article to tell you about the experience. And this is a nice, they say, for the benefit of property owners, we are recapping the areas involved. So they say it was Heath Creek Wash, which crosses the Lone Pine Highway between Blackbird Road and Heath Creek Drive, was flooded from the mouth of the wash to Highway 2. It covered the area from Lone Pine Highway to Highway 2, overflowing on parts of Blackbird, Sparrow, Thrush, and Lynette, and bordering on Twin Lakes Drive, approximately 2 blocks up or south from Highway 2. So that kind of gives you the boundaries, as they describe it, of the flood here. So you'll see in this image, it describes 2 homes on the south side of Thrush Road, looking from the backside where mud and rocks hurled themselves around and through to continue down Thrush Road toward the highway. A few more images from this Wrightwood Mountaineer article. Here we have looking west toward Lone Pine Highway on Lynette. Main wash poured down Thrush with some overflowing onto this upper portion of Lynette, washing out the road in many places. And you can see the water pouring down. I believe this is Lynette right here that we're looking at. The next image from this article, the south view of Bradmere home, indicating path of water where it overflowed from Sheep Wash. And so you can see on the left here where the house is just flooded by all of the rock and debris. And then in this image here, it's of State Highway 2. The left shows how Sheep Creek Wash filled the highway bridge railing on the south side. The center view indicates damage sustained by water, rocks, and debris flowing over and around the bridge, beginning to undermine from the north side. The right photo shows dozers clearing highway on Thanksgiving Day and attempting to open the channel from the south side to permit water to flow again under the bridge. And for this flood, the county flood control records show 450,000 cubic yards of mud flowed. And so if you think 1941, I said it was 1.2 million cubic yards. This one was 450,000. So about a third, between a third and a half of the previous flood. A little more, here's another article we have in the archives from the Los Angeles Evening and Sunday Herald Examiner from November 24th. And they say, at Wrightwood in the San Bernardino Mountains, west of Cajon Pass, 8 homes were destroyed. There were no casualties since most of the families had been evacuated. Many of the homes left standing were filled with mud to the ceiling. Huge boulders roared down mountainsides, smashed into other structures. A big section of the main street in Wrightwood, Lone Pine Canyon Road, was washed out. Some 40 evacuees were taken to emergency shelters at the school for the night. And then another article from the 1965 flood. This is from the San Bernardino Sun on December 2nd, 1965. The article was titled "Flood Buried Many Homes, Ripped Roads," and it's by Mike Murphy. And they describe in detail, as snow covers most parts of the area, but does not hide the sea of gray mud and rocks, which buried at least 7 homes and partially or totally damaged 15 others. One street no longer exists. Most of another is a collection of mud and rocks. The mud flowed like lava from an earth-lined flood control channel. Raging waters cut holes in the dike, and the mud flowed around and through homes on its way to the canyon floor. Mud at least 8 feet deep has obliterated the landscape, so 8 feet of mud. Glenn McKelvey has lived at 1842 Sparrow Road for 13 years. Boulders were bouncing down the hill like rubber balls, he remarked. The roar of the water was deafening. I never saw anything like it. Of 6 houses on the south side of Sparrow Road, the north side of what was Blackbird Road, 2 were livable and 4 others were buried by the mudslide. And I find it funny in here that they refer to what was Blackbird Road, as that sounds like it must have gotten washed out. At 1887 Sparrow Road, furniture was strewn 20 feet from the cabin. The living room, kitchen, and bedroom filled with mud within a few feet of the roof. Lone Pine Canyon Road was a sea of mud and water between Sparrow and Thrush Roads. Most of the community's paved streets served as drains during the storm. The result was that a service station and a cafe on the north side of Highway 2 at the bottom of the hill were blitzed in a sea of mud. Wrightwood was hit by slides in the past, but residents were quick to say that this last one was the worst. And now we have a few large-scale images that we have in our collections of this flood. They were taken by Donald Buchanan, who is a professor, I think, of geology at Victor Valley College, and he later donated them to the Wrightwood History Museum. So this image is a home on Sparrow Road, which was buried to the eaves, incredibly. The next image, also by Donald Buchanan, is another home on Sparrow Road. I'm guessing these were some of the houses that were referred to as completely destroyed in the news articles. And then here's another, and we have a little more information on this one. It was a log cabin located at 5556 Heath Creek Road. And the picture was taken on the north side of the wash, looking southeast. And again, this was taken by Donald Buchanan of Victor Valley College. And next, I'm going to show you, we have some video footage of the 1965 mudslide. So I'm going to go ahead and let this play for us. A little bit. So as you saw in those images, the mud just flowing in and around all of the houses and the boulders rolling through the mud as if they were little tiny rocks. So after that, in course of reading all of this, I thought, well, when did they build Heath Wash to be much more stable to contain the floods? And so actually in 1966, right after the 1965 flood, was when they worked on a flood control project at Heath Creek. And here's an article from the Mountaineer that's called "Rechanneling of Heath Creek is on Schedule." And just a few notes from what they did to keep Heath Creek kind of in its place for any future floods. It says, as a result of excessive rains last winter, when portions of San Bernardino County were declared a disaster area, a contract was let for restoration of the Heath Creek Wash. Heavy equipment rolled into Wrightwood and began work on September 26th. Construction includes a dip crossing at Lone Pine and at Thrush Road. The slopes from the top of the channel down will make it possible for the water to keep moving rapidly enough to prevent stoppage from debris. The dip crossing at Lone Pine will be about 400 feet wide, reaching a maximum at the center of approximately 7 to 8 feet below present elevation. So they dug about 8 feet lower into the creek than it was prior. According to the specifications, the channel should be sufficient to handle above normal rainfall. In case the capacity of the channel is exceeded by extremely intense precipitation, the channel and levee systems should help minimize flood damage. And if you hadn't walked over to the Heath Creek, we live right below it. You do kind of have to walk up to the levee and then down and down a series of pathways to get actually to the base of the creek. It's quite deep, which is hopefully a promising construction that they've made. And since it was built in 1966, the next flood that we'll look at was in 78, and thankfully no damage to homes happened in 78. So since this flood control project, there have been no more floods that have damaged homes. So hopefully it stays that way. So looking next at the May 1978 flood. Here again, we have articles from the Mountaineer Progress from May 17th, 1978. And again, they credit this flood to a rapid rise in temperature and quick snow melt from on top of our mountains. So it quotes, "The rapid rise in temperature on Thursday and Friday is credited with triggering the mud flow. The pack of snow on the mudslide was melting into already saturated soil, creating runoff similar to that experienced almost precisely 9 years ago," referring to the 65 flood. "Fire trucks blasted from their loudspeakers in the area. Due to mud flow in the Heath Creek Wash, there is a chance that debris may not be confined to the channel, thus endangering the area bounded by Elm Street, Highway 2, Heath Creek, and Thrush. Crews from San Bernardino County Flood Control worked 24 hours for 10 days to keep the Heath Creek channel moving and away from property. 6 to 8 feet of debris covered Highway 2 bridge over Heath Creek." So essentially, we had a very similar flood to the previous ones with the mud flowing, but because the work had been done to deepen the channel, and combined with all of the work by County Fire, we were able to avoid County Fire and County Flood, able to avoid the disaster that we'd seen in the previous 2 floods. And what we have in our next slide is some images from this flood, but also a bit of interview footage with our former fire chief, Bob Hedden, where he describes the work done in the 1978 mud flood to prevent damage. So I'll let him tell us about it. He was there too.
Well, The rocks obviously were hitting against one another, and they were making a sound, but it was somewhat muffled by the, as I call it, the slurry. Kind of sound a little bit like a bowling alley, the pins in a bowling alley.
At the front of this one, it's about 30 feet across and several others behind it. Looks like it may be a couple hundred yards of debris.
It was fairly loud. In fact, there were times when the first few days I would go up there, time or two, I thought, maybe I shouldn't be here. My contingency was the main reason I was there was for the safety of the town. And I wanted to determine if there was at some point I would call for evacuation. We had heavy snow with mixture of rain, and so all of the creeks were full. And we did have some local flow coming through some houses. We had to literally get all of our people out and started in the night. And we had to go up and sandbag and try to divert that away from 2 homes. Actually, when that one started, we were having a fireman's ball up at the community building. And we were notified that we have some major problems going on. We evacuated and the wives went home and all the men went over there. And we started sandbagging and trying to divert what we could. Initially, all we had were a couple of bulldozers from county flood control. And they were fighting a losing battle. The controlling force, of course, was the water melting from the snow. And as that, in the initial stages, they had a lot of snow and water potential there. And that's where we got the big problem to begin with. Well, actually, in the area by the Methodist camp, it did breach the channel while I was doing observations there. If I would go to lunch and then come back, I could see that it had breached the channel and gone over. Well, it's there. There's no question about that, and it's going to be there. It's something that you either live with or you move, if it bothers you enough. Personally, I'm going to stay here. I've been here for 30 years, and this is where I'll leave this earth. If you want to call it a fear factor at the time, and Art Seidler, who was the head of the flood control at the time, attempted to pass a scenario, well, if we have an earthquake at the same time as this episode is going on, then we would lose the whole town. You know, disasters are predicated on you take care of what you have in front of you. We wanted to evacuate the town and just make it a ghost town. it was mentioned by the director of the county flood control that we should evacuate the whole town as a safety factor and
evacuate it permanently.
evacuate it permanently and not try to rebuild or to come back in. And that was one of the scenarios that he brought up at the time. Well, what if you have an earthquake at the same time? Yes, I think that were I to experience the same thing today, I would probably make the same observations. Absolutely, it was an awesome thing, no question about it. Those large boulders, some of those weighed several tons, and they were bobbing like corks going down the channel. And I felt that they must have taken on the specific gravity of the slurry in order to do that. Otherwise, I don't know how you would move something of that size and weight.
Okay. So from what we've seen, just a few points of conclusion, kind of recapping from our first slide that we saw, that Wrightwood is prone to these mud floods and that we typically get a small one at least every year. And that, as Fire Chief Bob Hedden said, this is something we live with here. We have put, or I should say the county and the Army Corps of Engineer has deepened the Heath Channel and they've built the levees to try to contain the mud floods, but it's always a possibility. And in the future, the conditions that create these mud floods, because you always wonder, will this happen again, is rapidly rising temperatures with a lot of snowpack or really heavy rains. And I'd say one of the longest lasting results for those of us who are residents, especially in this area, is the flood insurance that we pay, even though we have those levies to protect us in the case that this happens. And just knowing that our county fire and the flood control has done a lot of work to try to protect us for the future. But that covers what I wanted to share with you for our 1941, 1965, and 1978 mud floods. I'll pull back up our information about our future events in case you join late. We do have a few fun events coming up in the future, our History in a Suitcase presentations with the Wrightwood Elementary 4th graders, our Camp Cajon field trip, both in March, and then our Wildflower Walk on April 1st. And I'll stay on for a bit if anybody has any questions or you want me to revisit any of the slides, newspaper articles, video that I covered today. And if not, thank you so much for joining our talk today.